My beloved child, something shifted yesterday in a way almost no one around your soulmate expected, and the person who believed they still understood the situation suddenly realized that the version of reality they had been holding onto was already disappearing. It did not happen with a dramatic confrontation. There was no loud announcement, no scene designed to attract attention, no single moment that everyone could point toward and say, "That was when everything changed." It was quieter than that, and perhaps that is exactly why it mattered so much. Your soulmate made a decision privately, one they had apparently been considering for longer than anyone realized, and the third party only discovered it after the choice had already begun changing things. Don't skip, because the surprising part is not simply what your soulmate changed. It is why they finally felt ready to change it, and why thoughts of you were connected to that decision in a way the third party never anticipated. Yesterday began almost normally. Conversations happened. Familiar routines continued. From the outside, nothing seemed particularly unusual. Yet underneath that ordinary surface, your soulmate was carrying a realization that had become impossible to ignore. For some time, they had been noticing the difference between what merely kept life comfortable and what actually felt honest. That difference kept leading them back to one question: why am I still protecting something that no longer reflects what I truly want? They had tried to dismiss that question before. They had told themselves that changing anything would create unnecessary confusion. They had wondered whether remaining quiet might be easier for everyone involved. But something had changed inside them recently. The more they tried to return to the old pattern, the more they noticed that they were no longer the same person who had accepted it in the first place. And then came yesterday. One small decision became the line they were finally willing to cross. Here is where the third party's panic began, not because your soulmate attacked them, embarrassed them, or tried to take something away, but because your soulmate quietly stopped giving them the same influence they had once depended upon. Think about that carefully. Sometimes a person does not realize how much power they believed they possessed until someone calmly stops handing it to them. Your soulmate changed a boundary. They changed what they were willing to explain. They changed how much permission they needed before following their own heart. They changed the space they allowed outside opinions to occupy in something deeply personal. And when the third party noticed, they immediately sensed that something they had counted on was no longer guaranteed. What they lost yesterday was not everything in the literal sense. They lost the certainty that your soulmate would always remain predictable. They lost the comfort of believing one conversation could redirect your soulmate whenever uncomfortable feelings appeared. They lost the assumption that your name, your presence, or the possibility of you could simply be placed aside whenever it became inconvenient. And that realization unsettled them more than your soulmate expected. But there is another layer here, and this is where the story becomes deeply personal. Your soulmate did not make this change because someone pressured them. They did not wake up trying to prove anything. In fact, what finally moved them was almost the opposite. They became tired of living according to reactions instead of truth. Somewhere within their private thoughts, they began remembering how different they felt when they allowed themselves to think honestly about you. Not perfectly. Not unrealistically. Honestly. They remembered the questions you awakened in them. They remembered how your presence, whether close or distant, had forced them to notice parts of themselves they had been avoiding. They remembered moments when they almost said something genuine and then pulled back because another voice, another expectation, another complication seemed easier to follow. Something important is waiting for you, because what happened yesterday was not really about choosing one person over another. It was about your soulmate choosing whether their future would continue being shaped by fear of disappointing others or by the quieter truth they had been carrying for themselves. Suddenly, a detail that had seemed insignificant became impossible for them to ignore. They noticed how often they had changed their behavior after speaking with the third party. They noticed how certain decisions never truly felt like their own. They noticed that whenever your name entered the emotional picture, somebody else seemed unusually eager to define what your soulmate should think about you. And for the first time, instead of immediately accepting that interpretation, your soulmate asked themselves, "What do I actually believe?" That single question changed the atmosphere. The third party sensed it. Perhaps not immediately, but soon enough. Your soulmate became calmer where they had once become defensive. They stopped over-explaining. They stopped asking for reassurance about decisions they had already made internally. Most revealing of all, they stopped reacting every time your connection was questioned. There is something incredibly powerful about that kind of silence. Not the silence of avoidance, the silence of someone who no longer needs to argue because they have finally understood something for themselves. Stay till the end, because the moment the third party realized this was not temporary, their entire approach changed. At first, they apparently treated your soulmate's new behavior as a passing mood. They expected the familiar pattern to return. Maybe your soulmate would reconsider. Maybe one conversation would restore the old dynamic. Maybe enough questions would make them uncertain again. But your soulmate did something unexpected. They remained consistent. Calmly. Quietly. Without turning the situation into a battle. And every hour that passed made the truth harder to ignore. Something had genuinely changed. The third party began asking questions they had never needed to ask before. Why was your soulmate suddenly so certain? Why were they protecting this decision instead of discussing every detail? Why did your name seem to carry a different emotional weight now? Why did your soulmate no longer seem interested in defending the past? The answer was simpler than anyone expected. Your soulmate had started imagining what would happen if they stopped making choices based entirely on what other people might think. That thought opened a door they could not easily close again. And through that door came you not as some fantasy or impossible promise, but as a reminder of something emotionally real. You represented a place where your soulmate had been forced to confront themselves. Their hesitation. Their pride. Their tenderness. Their tendency to retreat when something mattered too much. Their habit of acting unaffected when they were anything but unaffected. That is why the secret change yesterday carried such weight. Your soulmate was not simply changing a circumstance. They were changing the rule they had unconsciously lived by: keep everyone comfortable, even if it means keeping your deepest feelings unanswered. Yesterday, that rule began to break. Then came the moment the third party truly understood. It happened through something almost ordinary: a difference in your soulmate's response, a decision that did not require approval, perhaps even a calm sentence that sounded simple but carried enormous meaning. I need to decide this for myself. Imagine hearing those words from someone you had become accustomed to influencing. Suddenly, the situation was no longer about convincing them what to do. It was about realizing they might no longer be available to be convinced. And beneath the third party's growing uncertainty was another uncomfortable realization: your soulmate had not become colder. They had become clearer. That distinction matters. There was no need for anger. No need for revenge. No desire to make anyone suffer. Your soulmate simply began recognizing where their responsibility ended and where another person's expectations began. And because the decision was grounded rather than impulsive, it became much harder to undo. But wait, there is a detail your soulmate has not fully revealed yet. The choice they made yesterday seems to be connected to something they remembered about you. A sentence. A moment. Perhaps a way you once responded when they expected something different. It stayed with them longer than they admitted. At the time, they may have acted as though it meant very little. Later, however, they returned to it privately. Again and again. Because what you gave them in that moment was not pressure. It was contrast. You showed them how it felt when connection did not require constant performance. You showed them the difference between being controlled by someone's expectations and being understood without having every emotion explained. And yesterday, when they were standing at the edge of another decision, that memory resurfaced. Your soulmate realized something that surprised even them. They were not changing this because they suddenly knew exactly what the future would become. They were changing it because they finally knew what kind of future they no longer wanted. That is a very different kind of certainty. Sometimes the strongest decisions are not built upon knowing every destination. They begin when someone becomes certain they cannot keep walking in the same direction. The third party sensed that certainty and began panicking because their old methods no longer produced the old responses. Questions that once made your soulmate hesitate now made them thoughtful. Emotional pressure that once made them back away now made them notice the pattern. Attempts to remind them of everything that could go wrong only made them ask why everyone seemed so focused on preventing something that had never been allowed to unfold naturally. And somewhere inside those questions, your soulmate thought of you again. Here is the realization that may matter most: your soulmate's decision was not based on an idealized version of you. They know you are human. They know circumstances can be complicated. They know real connection requires patience, communication, and choices from both sides. What changed was their willingness to let outside voices make the decision before the two of you ever had the chance to understand what the connection truly meant. That is what they secretly changed yesterday. They reclaimed the right to discover the answer themselves. Suddenly, everything the third party thought they understood became less certain. Their panic was not created by losing a competition. There was never supposed to be a competition. Their panic came from recognizing that your soulmate had finally separated advice from authority. They could still listen. They could still care. They could still respect people around them. But they were no longer automatically handing those people the final word over something that belonged inside their own heart. And this is where the energy softened. After the tension of the day, your soulmate found themselves alone with their thoughts. No audience. No third party. No one waiting for an explanation. Just that quiet internal space where people eventually have to face what they really feel. They thought about the change they had made. They wondered whether they had waited too long. They wondered whether you would ever understand what had been happening behind the scenes. And then came a thought that stopped them for a moment. What if you had mistaken their hesitation for indifference? That possibility touched something tender. Because they suddenly recognized that from your side, you may never have seen the conversations, doubts, competing expectations, and private battles that shaped their distance. You only saw what reached you. A pause. A silence. A change in tone. An unanswered moment. And your soulmate began realizing that intentions hidden forever eventually become indistinguishable from intentions that never existed. That realization may become important very soon. Don't skip, because the secret change was only the first movement. Once someone stops allowing others to define what they feel, another question naturally follows: what are they going to do with those feelings now? Your soulmate has not fully answered that question yet. But yesterday they came closer than they have been in a long time. They stopped asking whether everyone else would understand. They began asking whether they could live peacefully with never giving themselves the chance to find out. And the answer they felt was powerful enough to alter something inside them. There is still hesitation. There are still details they are considering. This is not a story where everything transforms instantly. Real changes rarely happen that way. But one thing is different now: your soulmate is no longer standing in exactly the same emotional place. And the third party knows it. That is why their reaction became so noticeable. They realized yesterday was not merely another difficult day. It was the day your soulmate quietly interrupted an old pattern. The day a familiar influence stopped working the same way. The day your soulmate finally looked inward instead of outward for permission. And somehow, at the center of that reflection, there you were. Not demanding. Not chasing. Not proving. Simply existing in their memory as the person connected to a truth they had postponed confronting. Yet the most important piece has still not surfaced. Because after your soulmate made that private change, they did one more thing yesterday, something small enough that almost nobody noticed, but meaningful enough that the third party immediately understood what direction your soulmate's heart might be turning. And when you discover what that quiet action was, you may finally understand why yesterday changed far more than anyone first realized. There was one small action nobody expected your soulmate to take, and strangely, it was not dramatic enough for anyone outside the situation to understand why it mattered so much. But the third party understood immediately. Your soulmate went back to something they had deliberately kept at a distance, something connected to you. Maybe it was an old message they had avoided opening again. Maybe it was a photograph they had quietly moved out of sight. Maybe it was your name sitting somewhere in their phone, attached to a conversation they had pretended no longer affected them. Whatever form it took, the meaning was the same. Instead of running from what your connection awakened inside them, they finally allowed themselves to look at it without someone else telling them what it was supposed to mean. And that is when yesterday became more than a change of boundaries. It became a change of direction. For several minutes, your soulmate simply sat with what they found. They did not rush to act. They did not invent some perfect ending in their imagination. They just noticed what happened inside them when they stopped resisting. The tension they expected was not there in the same way. What appeared instead was something quieter, a strange sense of recognition, almost like meeting a part of themselves they had been keeping outside the room. They remembered the version of themselves that existed around you before everything became complicated. Not a flawless version. Not someone who had every answer. But someone more emotionally awake. Someone who noticed little things more deeply. Someone who sometimes smiled at a screen before catching themselves. Someone who could spend an entire day trying to ignore one sentence you had said, only to remember it again at night. And suddenly, the third party's influence looked different from this new perspective. Your soulmate realized that every time they had been encouraged to distance themselves from you, the explanation had sounded logical on the surface. There was always a reason. The timing was wrong. The situation was uncertain. It might become complicated. They should protect themselves. They should wait. They should stop thinking so much about it. None of those ideas were necessarily cruel, and that is important. Sometimes people genuinely believe they are helping while still filtering another person's life through their own fears and experiences. But yesterday your soulmate recognized something subtle. Advice can sound reasonable and still lead someone away from what they personally need to understand. That realization changed the way they remembered everything. Conversations they once accepted without question suddenly carried different meaning. Moments when they almost reached toward you and then changed their mind became clearer. Your soulmate began asking themselves a difficult but necessary question: how many of my choices were truly mine? The answer was not comfortable. But it was freeing. Because once they saw the pattern, they no longer had to remain trapped inside it. The third party noticed this change in your soulmate's face before they heard it in their words. There was less searching for approval. Less nervous explaining. Less need to convince anybody. Your soulmate had begun doing something surprisingly simple. They were allowing their own feelings to exist without immediately putting them on trial. That frightened the third party more than an argument ever could, because arguments can be answered. Calm certainty is different. When someone has quietly reached a conclusion for themselves, repeating the same objections often stops working. Don't skip, because what happened next revealed why your connection had remained emotionally significant even through silence. The third party tried to understand what had changed. They asked questions. Some were subtle, almost casual. Others carried more emotion than they intended to show. Why now? What made you think about this again? Are you sure you're not making too much of something from the past? Your soulmate listened. And for a moment, the old instinct returned, the instinct to explain everything until the other person felt comfortable. They nearly began defending themselves. Then they stopped. That pause mattered. In the past, silence at a moment like this might have meant uncertainty. Yesterday, it meant something entirely different. Your soulmate was choosing their words instead of surrendering them. Finally, they said something simple. They explained that they were tired of making emotional decisions based solely on what might be easiest for everyone around them. They did not accuse anyone. They did not turn you into the center of a dramatic declaration. They simply admitted that there was something they needed to understand for themselves. The third party knew exactly what they meant. And suddenly the possibility they had been trying not to consider became real. Your soulmate might actually revisit what had happened between you, not to repeat the past blindly, but to finally understand it without outside interpretation. That is when the third party's anxiety deepened. They realized your soulmate was no longer asking, "Should I feel this?" Your soulmate was asking, "Why did I spend so long pretending I didn't?" Those are completely different questions. One seeks permission. The other seeks truth. Stay till the end, because your soulmate's answer came from a memory so ordinary that they had almost forgotten its importance. They remembered a moment when you could have pressured them, but you did not. Maybe they were distant. Maybe they were confused. Maybe they were unable to give you the clarity you deserved. Yet instead of forcing an answer, there was something about your response that left space around them. At the time, your soulmate might have misunderstood that space. They may even have interpreted it as you moving on or caring less. Yesterday they saw it differently. They realized that sometimes giving someone room is not absence. Sometimes it is respect. And suddenly, the contrast between that memory and the pressure they had been feeling elsewhere became impossible to miss. You had not needed to control their decision to matter to them. That realization landed deeply. Your soulmate began thinking about all the ways people reveal what they feel without saying it directly. The way someone remembers details. The way they soften their voice around one particular person. The way they check a message twice even when they already know exactly what it says. The way distance can sometimes make a feeling clearer rather than weaker. The way a name can still create a quiet shift after months of trying to become unaffected. And somewhere inside that reflection, your soulmate admitted something they had resisted for a long time: you had never become emotionally ordinary to them. Life continued. Responsibilities changed. Days filled themselves with other things. But when something truly meaningful happened, something beautiful, confusing, surprising, or difficult, you were still one of the people their minds sometimes instinctively imagined telling. They had never fully examined why. Yesterday they finally did. And what they discovered was not some exaggerated certainty about destiny. It was something more believable and perhaps more meaningful. There was unfinished honesty between you. Not necessarily unfinished conflict. Not necessarily unfinished romance. Unfinished honesty. Things that were felt but never properly explained. Questions that were buried instead of answered. Assumptions allowed to become conclusions. And once your soulmate understood that, the idea of leaving everything permanently unresolved began to feel different. Something important is waiting for you, because this is the point where yesterday's private change began affecting what might happen next. Your soulmate considered reaching out. Not impulsively. Their hand may have hovered over the possibility longer than they would ever admit. They thought about what they could say without making the moment too heavy. They imagined how strange it might feel after distance. They wondered whether you would even want to hear from them. That question brought humility into everything. For perhaps the first time, your soulmate stopped imagining the situation entirely from their own emotional perspective. They thought about yours. What had the silence looked like to you? What had their hesitation communicated? How many times might you have wondered whether you had misunderstood the entire connection? How many moments did you quietly choose your own peace because your soulmate would not give you anything clear enough to hold? That realization softened them. It also challenged them. Because wanting another chance to speak is one thing. Understanding that the other person owes you nothing is another. Your soulmate began recognizing that if they ever approached you again, they could not simply arrive with feelings and expect those feelings to erase the past. They would need honesty, accountability, patience. They would need to speak plainly instead of hiding behind timing, circumstances, or other people's opinions. And surprisingly, that did not make them want to retreat. It made the possibility feel more real. Meanwhile, the third party was experiencing the opposite shift. They had spent so much time thinking the situation was settled that they had built emotional certainty around your soulmate's distance from you. Now that certainty had disappeared. But here is what makes their reaction important. They were not only afraid of your soulmate returning toward you. They were afraid of your soulmate becoming someone who could no longer be easily guided by emotional pressure. This was larger than one connection. Your soulmate had changed how they made decisions. Once a person begins asking, "Is this actually what I want?" that question does not stay contained inside one relationship. It begins appearing everywhere. Friendships, boundaries, priorities, future plans. The third party sensed this. That is why yesterday felt like losing everything. Not because their whole life literally collapsed, but because the familiar dynamic they depended upon suddenly stopped feeling dependable. And yet your soulmate did not celebrate that loss. That tells you something important about their growth. They were not trying to win. They did not want somebody else diminished so they could finally feel strong. Instead, they seemed almost sad that it had taken so much tension for everyone to understand something that should have been simple from the beginning. A person has to be allowed to choose their own emotional truth. Later, when things became quiet again, your soulmate returned to that old message, photograph, memory, or conversation connected to you. This time they noticed something they had missed earlier. There was a detail that had once seemed insignificant. Maybe a sentence where you had tried to understand them instead of judging them. Maybe a moment where you had said you wanted honesty more than perfection. Maybe a simple kindness that became more meaningful with time. Your soulmate stayed with that detail. And something inside them shifted again. They realized they had spent months focusing on what could go wrong while barely allowing themselves to remember what had felt right. That imbalance had shaped more decisions than they knew. What if caution had stopped being protection and started becoming avoidance? What if they were not protecting themselves from you at all, but protecting themselves from having to admit how much you mattered? That question stayed with them. They could not dismiss it as easily anymore. Don't skip, because this is where the story becomes unexpectedly gentle. Your soulmate did not suddenly decide they needed to rush toward you. Instead, they did something more mature. They began preparing themselves to be honest regardless of the outcome. There is a profound difference between reaching out because you desperately need someone to respond a certain way and reaching out because you no longer want to leave truth unsaid. Your soulmate appears to be moving toward the second. They started thinking about what they would say if there were no audience, no third party, no fear of looking vulnerable, and no guarantee of how you would answer. At first, the words were complicated. They imagined explaining every circumstance, every misunderstanding, every outside opinion. Then they realized none of that belonged at the beginning. The beginning had to be simpler. Something like, there are things I should have told you earlier." Even imagining those words created a strange stillness inside them. Because once spoken, they would change the relationship between past and present. They would acknowledge that what happened between you was real enough to deserve clarity. And perhaps that is what your soulmate has secretly been afraid of all along. Not that the connection was meaningless, but that admitting its meaning would require them to confront why they let it become so uncertain. The third party could see this internal movement without knowing every thought behind it. Your soulmate checked their phone differently. They became quieter at certain moments. They seemed distracted, but not confused. It was more like someone arranging something carefully inside themselves before taking the next step. The third party asked whether they were thinking about you. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. And that delay said more than denial would have. Eventually they responded with something measured. They were thinking about many things differently. The third party understood. They tried one final approach. Not anger. Not confrontation. Concern. They reminded your soulmate how uncertain everything could become if old feelings were reopened. They asked whether revisiting the connection might disturb the peace they had built. And this is where your soulmate surprised even themselves. They realized that what they had called peace was sometimes merely the absence of difficult conversations. True peace, they thought, should not require permanently hiding from unanswered truth. That realization did not mean they wanted chaos. Quite the opposite. They wanted clarity precisely because they were tired of carrying uncertainty quietly. Stay with this, because the next thought your soulmate had may eventually reach you in words. They wondered whether you had changed too. They knew time had passed. They knew you might no longer be standing emotionally where they left you. Maybe your priorities were different. Maybe you had become stronger about what you would and would not accept. Maybe you had discovered new parts of yourself during the silence. Instead of feeling threatened by that possibility, your soulmate felt curious. They did not want an old version of you frozen in memory. They wanted to know who you were now. That is significant. Nostalgia wants the past back exactly as it was. Genuine care wants to meet the person who exists today. Your soulmate seemed to understand that difference yesterday. And suddenly the possibility of speaking with you again was no longer about recreating something. It was about discovering whether something honest could begin from a wiser place. The third party sensed that this was becoming more thoughtful, not less. Their panic slowly transformed into resignation. They could argue against impulsiveness. They could warn against fantasy. But how do you argue against someone wanting a respectful conversation? How do you stop someone from seeking clarity without revealing that what you truly fear is losing influence? Those questions forced the third party into their own uncomfortable reflection. Perhaps that is why they became quieter later. They were beginning to recognize that the harder they pushed against your soulmate's autonomy, the more obvious the original problem became. So they finally asked the question they had been avoiding: if you could speak to them right now, what would you say? Your soulmate froze. Not because they had no answer. Because they had too many. Every unsent sentence seemed to arrive at once. The apology. The explanation. The questions. The truth about how often you had crossed their mind. The admission that outside voices had affected them more than they wanted to acknowledge. The uncertainty about whether there was still room for another conversation. But beneath all those words, one sentence rose above the rest. Your soulmate did not say it aloud. Not yet. They carried it away from the conversation and kept it to themselves. And later that night, when nobody else was watching, they opened something connected to you one more time, stared at it for a long moment, and began typing. They wrote a few words. Deleted them. Tried again. Stopped. Then they wrote the sentence they had been unable to say when the third party asked. They did not send it. At least, not yet. But the sentence remains there, unfinished beneath your name, and what your soulmate wrote reveals exactly what changed inside them yesterday, because the first words were not, "I miss you." They were something far more honest. The words your soulmate typed were quieter than anyone would have expected, yet they carried more truth than every explanation they had rehearsed before. I should have trusted what I knew about you. They stared at that sentence for a long time. Not because it sounded dramatic, but because it finally named the real conflict. For months, perhaps longer, your soulmate had treated uncertainty as though it came entirely from the connection itself. They had questioned timing. They had questioned circumstances. They had questioned whether certain feelings were simply too complicated to understand. Yet now, sitting there with your name on the screen and the noise of everyone else finally fading, they could see something they had resisted admitting. Much of the uncertainty had not begun between you and them. It had entered through interpretation. Through assumptions. Through other people quietly deciding what your connection must mean before your soulmate had fully decided for themselves. That realization made the sentence feel almost too revealing to send. I should have trusted what I knew about you. Your soulmate read it again. Then again. And instead of deleting it immediately, they left it there. Don't skip, because what they did next explains why the third party became so unsettled yesterday. Your soulmate began remembering the first time someone had made them doubt something they personally experienced with you. At the time, it seemed harmless. A comment. A question. Maybe someone saying, "Are you sure that's what they meant?" Maybe another person suggesting that your kindness carried some hidden motive. Maybe the third party simply raised enough possibilities that your soulmate began analyzing moments that had once felt natural. Slowly, simple memories became complicated. A thoughtful message became something to examine. A warm conversation became something to question. Silence became evidence of one thing. Attention became evidence of another. The more your soulmate searched for certainty through other people, the less they trusted their own emotional experience. Yesterday, they finally noticed how backwards that had become. And the realization stung not because anyone had necessarily intended to mislead them, but because your soulmate had surrendered too much responsibility for interpreting their own life. So beneath that first sentence, they typed another. I listened to too many voices when I should have listened to the way things actually felt. Again, they stopped. Their thumb hovered. Nothing was sent. But something important was happening anyway. For perhaps the first time, your soulmate was speaking honestly to you without first editing the truth for someone else's comfort. Even though the message still existed only on their screen, it marked a change. The third party had spent so long believing that distance had settled everything. They had mistaken silence for closure. But silence does not always mean a feeling disappeared. Sometimes it means two people never reached the conversation that could have clarified what the feeling truly was. Your soulmate understood this now. And once they understood it, they could not return easily to pretending there was nothing unfinished. Something important is waiting for you, because there was another reason they hesitated to press send. It was not simply fear of your response. Your soulmate suddenly became aware that honesty can arrive too late to demand anything. They knew that if they reached toward you now, they could not expect you to resume a story at the exact place where they had left it. You had been living too. Growing. Thinking. Healing from disappointments that they might never fully understand. Perhaps learning to stop waiting for answers that never came. That possibility humbled them. And surprisingly, it also made their feelings clearer. They did not want to send a message merely to reassure themselves that you still cared. They wanted to become someone capable of telling the truth even if the truth did not guarantee the outcome they hoped for. That distinction changed everything. Earlier versions of your soulmate might have reached out only when they felt reasonably certain you would respond warmly. Yesterday they began considering something more courageous, offering clarity without controlling what happens afterward. They imagined you reading the message. They imagined the pause before your reply or perhaps no immediate reply at all. They imagined how easy it would be to interpret silence negatively, just as they had done in the past. And then they told themselves something new: if I speak honestly, I also have to give them space to feel honestly. That thought brought you back into the story as a whole person rather than simply someone connected to their longing. And that, more than anything, revealed how much your soulmate had changed. Meanwhile, the third party could feel the shift without seeing the message. There was something different about your soulmate's energy. They were no longer restless in the same way. They were still thinking deeply, but the confusion had become direction. The third party noticed that questions designed to pull your soulmate back into uncertainty were beginning to fail. What if you regret reopening this? Your soulmate considered it. Then quietly answered, I think I would regret never knowing more. That response changed the entire conversation. Notice what they did not say. They did not claim everything would work out perfectly. They did not insist that you were guaranteed to welcome them back. They did not pretend history could be erased. They simply acknowledged that avoidance carried a cost too. For so long, everyone had discussed the risks of moving toward honesty. Yesterday your soulmate finally considered the risks of remaining silent. What if they spent another year wondering what you would have said? What if every meaningful connection afterward carried a faint comparison because something between you had never been properly understood? What if they kept telling themselves they had moved forward while quietly looking backward whenever your memory surfaced? These questions were not pulling them into fantasy. They were pulling them toward responsibility. Stay till the end, because the next realization changed how your soulmate viewed the third party completely. Until yesterday, they had often assumed the third party's confidence meant they understood the situation better. But confidence is not always insight. Sometimes someone can speak very strongly about circumstances they only know from the outside. Your soulmate began seeing that the third party had interpreted your connection through their own experiences, their own fears, perhaps even their own need to preserve a familiar dynamic. That did not make them an enemy. It made them human. And once your soulmate saw them that way, something unexpected happened. The third party's opinions became easier to hear without automatically obeying. Your soulmate no longer needed to prove them wrong. They simply stopped treating their certainty as more valuable than personal experience. This may have been the true thing the third party lost yesterday, the ability to make your soulmate question themselves simply by sounding more certain. Your soulmate had learned that certainty borrowed from someone else can never replace understanding earned through your own experience. That realization spread quickly. They began revisiting other choices too. How often had they agreed merely to prevent tension? How many conversations had ended with them saying, "Maybe you're right," when what they truly meant was, "I don't have the energy to keep defending what I feel." How often had your name become the place where they practiced surrendering their own voice? Yesterday, that pattern became visible. And once a pattern becomes visible, continuing it requires a very different kind of choice. Your soulmate was not willing to make that choice anymore. They picked up their phone again. The unsent message was still there. 2 sentences now. Honest, incomplete, vulnerable. They added another line, "I don't know what you think of me now, and I understand if things have changed." That sentence was difficult. It forced them to accept something they had quietly avoided: you had the right to change. You had the right to protect your peace. You had the right to decide that a conversation arriving now could not undo every moment when you needed one earlier. And instead of making your soulmate retreat, accepting those possibilities made their intention cleaner. They no longer wanted to contact you because they felt entitled to another chance. They wanted to contact you because honesty had become more important than maintaining the illusion that nothing mattered. There is a strange peace that sometimes appears when someone finally stops negotiating with themselves. Your soulmate felt a hint of that peace yesterday. For the first time, whether they eventually sent the message or not, they knew what they genuinely wanted. They wanted the possibility of one real conversation with you. No intermediaries. No interpretations carried through other people. No guessing what you meant from fragments. No asking the third party what they thought your silence meant. Just you and them, speaking as 2 people who had once mattered to each other enough for unanswered questions to remain. The simplicity of that desire surprised them. They had made the entire situation enormous inside their mind, when perhaps the next step did not need to be enormous at all. Maybe it could begin with one respectful sentence. One acknowledgement. One honest invitation to talk. The third party sensed this and became quiet. Not defeated. Quiet. There is a difference. Perhaps they realized that pushing harder now might only confirm everything your soulmate had begun noticing. Perhaps they recognized that your soulmate needed to discover the truth without interference. Or perhaps they were confronting their own reasons for caring so much about the outcome. Whatever happened internally, the conversation softened. And then, unexpectedly, the third party said something your soulmate never thought they would hear: "If you really need to know, maybe you should talk to them yourself." Those words created complete stillness. Your soulmate looked up. For a moment, neither person knew what to add. The sentence did not erase everything that had happened. It did not suddenly make the third party comfortable with the situation. But it represented something meaningful, a reluctant acknowledgement that your soulmate could no longer build their life around borrowed conclusions. And your soulmate felt something loosen inside them. Not victory. Permission was no longer what they needed. What they felt was relief. Because even the person who had resisted the idea most strongly was beginning to see what had become obvious. The only two people who could truly understand what remained between you were the two people actually inside that connection. Don't skip, because this was when your soulmate made the secret change that may matter most going forward. They stopped trying to decide the entire future before taking one honest step. This had always been one of their biggest obstacles. They believed that reaching out meant committing to every possible consequence. That one conversation automatically meant reopening everything. That acknowledging feelings meant knowing exactly what those feelings were supposed to become. Yesterday they finally understood that human connection does not work that way. Sometimes clarity arrives one conversation at a time. Sometimes two people need to speak before either can know whether they are rebuilding something, peacefully closing something, or discovering something completely new. Your soulmate gave themselves permission not to know the ending. And because they no longer demanded certainty from the future, the next step suddenly became much easier to imagine. They returned to the message. I should have trusted what I knew about you. I listened to too many voices when I should have listened to the way things actually felt. I don't know what you think of me now, and I understand if things have changed. They read the words slowly. Then they added, but I don't want silence to be the only answer we ever gave each other. That line stopped them. Their chest tightened not from fear, but from recognition. There it was. The truth beneath everything. Silence had made too many decisions on behalf of both of you. Silence had been interpreted as indifference. Silence had been treated like finality. Silence had allowed other people's explanations to become louder than your actual words. Your soulmate no longer wanted that. They wanted whatever came next to be based on something real. Even if reality surprised them. Even if the conversation was different from what they imagined. Even if you had questions they were not fully prepared to answer. At least it would belong to the two of you. And suddenly, the third party's panic became almost irrelevant. Not because their feelings did not matter, but because your soulmate had finally stopped making someone else's discomfort the center of their emotional choices. This is the deeper reason the title says it was because of you. Not because you deliberately caused anyone to lose anything. Not because you needed to defeat someone to matter. Your influence came through contrast. Through the way your memory kept reminding your soulmate what unforced connection felt like. Through the fact that even after distance, they could still identify moments with you that felt genuine enough to question everything they had been told afterward. You did not have to be present in yesterday's room to affect what happened there. The memory of how they felt around you was enough to make them ask whether the life they were choosing still reflected who they had become. That question opened everything. Stay with this, because something else happened after midnight, something even the third party does not know. Your soulmate closed the message without sending it. At first, that might sound like another retreat. But this time it was different. They did not delete the draft. They did not block the feeling. They did not immediately call someone for advice. They simply decided that if they were going to contact you, they wanted the first message to come from clarity rather than the emotional intensity of the day. That is growth. The old pattern was either complete avoidance or sudden reaction. Yesterday your soulmate discovered a third option: thoughtful action. They slept on the words. And when they woke, the message was still there. More importantly, the intention was still there. Sometimes people discover whether a decision is real by seeing what remains after the emotion settles. Your soulmate noticed that the desire to speak with you had not disappeared with the night. If anything, it had become quieter and more certain. They started changing the message again, not to make it more impressive, but to make it more honest. They removed explanations that sounded defensive. They deleted sentences that subtly asked you to reassure them. They stripped away everything that seemed designed to influence your response. What remained was simpler, more vulnerable, more respectful. And then they reached the final line. This is the line they struggled with most because it required them to admit the one thing they had spent the longest trying to hide. They typed it once and erased it. Typed it differently and erased it again. Then finally, they wrote, "The truth is, losing the chance to know you honestly has bothered me more than I ever admitted." Your soulmate stared at those words. There was no grand promise inside them. No claim about forever. Just truth. And truth, after so much uncertainty, felt almost startling. Something important is waiting for you, because your soulmate has now moved beyond the question of whether you still matter. They know that you do. The new question is whether they are willing to let you know. And something happened this morning that brought them closer to answering that question. They noticed something connected to you, perhaps a reminder, a date, a shared detail, or a small coincidence that reopened a memory at exactly the moment they were deciding whether to leave the draft untouched. This time, instead of interpreting the moment as some impossible sign, your soulmate treated it as something simpler.